Thank you, Paul. So yes, I'm going to talk about the changes to the public finances that the Chancellor set out yesterday, and in particular focus what it's going to mean for the spending review that we now know will be announced or unveiled, the results of which will be unveiled alongside the Chancellor's autumn budget. And if I take you back to last October, this is what the forecast for public sector net borrowing looked like, the deficit falling from 2019-20 onwards, and that deficit at pretty low standards by UK historical standards, lower than what it was prior to the financial crisis. Yesterday, if the Chancellor had stood up and literally announced no policy changes, he would be able he would have set out a forecast that looks something like this. So a lower deficit in each, from the current financial year and each subsequent year throughout the forecast horizon, a deficit that's £8 billion lower in 23-24 than what he thought just 5 months ago. And there's two important drivers of this. One is that the outlook for debt interest spending has improved. Now, there's an important caveat on this. The OBR's forecasts for the economy assume a smooth Brexit process, but for debt interest payments, what they do is take market expectations of interest rates. Now, if financial markets are pricing in a chance of a no-deal Brexit, under which interest rates stay low for longer, that means that the OBR's debt interest forecast will be partly allowing for this, and if, and we should hope if, a no-deal disorderly Brexit does not occur, that may mean that much of the OBR's forecasts are correct or accurate or predicated on a correct assumption, but it may actually be the case that debt interest spending will turn out to be a bit greater than they expect, because maybe interest rates wouldn't stay as low for as long. So that's one improvement in the forecast that we might hope won't actually materialise. The other improvement in the forecast comes from higher income tax and NICS revenues, so stronger tax receipts. That's not because the OBR thinks the economy is going to grow more quickly over the next 5 years. They actually think the economy, both in cash terms and in nominal terms, will be pretty much the same size at the end of the forecast horizon as they thought back in October. So the same size of economy. But within that, they think that slightly more will be made up of earnings, and we pay more tax on earnings than we do on other components of GDP. So earnings are relatively tax-rich for the Chancellor, so that's good news for tax revenues. But there's also another thing going on. The OBR now thinks that those earnings are going to be less evenly distributed, and more of it will be received by people who pay higher tax rates. And I've got some graphs to illustrate that. If we take the growth in median earnings between 2016 and 2017, we can see that the data from April 2017 suggests that they fell slightly relative to inflation. But if we fill in what was happening to earnings across the rest of the distribution, we can see at the top end there was some evidence in April 2017 that earnings were growing a little bit quicker than the average. If we move forward to April 2018, we can see that earnings growth at the median had picked up a bit. It was a bit stronger relative to inflation. But if we fill in the whole distribution, we can see there's evidence that earnings growth at the very top was faster than average earnings. And because people at the top of the earnings distribution pay higher marginal rates of income tax, that's good news for tax revenues. Bad news for inequality, but good news for revenues. Now, the OBR's got access to more up-to-date data from real-time information. So that's the information that employers send HMRC every month. And what they've done is crunched the data for the first 6 months of this financial year and compared it to the same period last year. And in nominal terms, so not directly comparable to the figures on this chart, they've found that the top 0.1% of earners on average have seen their earnings rise by 5.9%, compared to average earnings across the board, which look like they're up by 3.7%. So continued evidence that earnings at the top of the distribution are growing faster than earnings elsewhere in the distribution. And as Paul mentioned, that's a bit of a turnaround from recent years. Over the period since the financial crisis, earnings and incomes at the very top of the distribution haven't been growing as strongly as the rest of the distribution. That's what the OBR had assumed that pattern would continue going forwards. If it reverses, while it may be bad news for inequality, it's clearly good news for tax revenues. So what did the Chancellor do with this windfall? Well, what he did essentially was bank most of it. So he announced some small giveaways, and I'll come back to those towards the end of this talk. But after taking account of the measures he announced yesterday, that March 2019 post-measures line, pretty similar to the March 2019 pre-measures line. So the deficit falling over time from 2019-20 onwards and running below that October 2018 forecast. So that's the latest forecast for the deficit. I think it's important to put that into context to compare it firstly to the forecast we saw a year ago. So there was a big improvement in the forecast that the OBR gave the Chancellor between March 18 and October 18. That was actually bigger than the improvement they handed him yesterday. And if we look at the current financial year, that reduction in the deficit, £14 billion to what was thought just 12 months ago, well, that's actually the biggest March-to-March revision that the OBR has made for the deficit in the coming financial year, and it's twice as big as the average revision that they have made. So the improvement that we've seen in the current year's deficit is big by the standards we've seen in recent years. Perhaps it's important to go back a bit further. For those of you who were in this room 36 months ago, George Osborne was Chancellor. He was talking about delivering a budget surplus in the coming financial, what would be the coming financial year, £11 billion. So you can see that while things have got a lot better in terms of the deficit outlook over the last 12 months, they've got a lot worse over the last 36 months. And if we take the deficit forecast for 2020-21, we can see that we're now on course to run a deficit £32 billion higher than was forecast just 3 years ago. Now, some other things that have changed since then include a change in Chancellor and also a change in fiscal targets. That surplus in 2019-20 was actually a manifesto commitment of the Conservatives back in 2015. That was abandoned, and Mr. Hammond set himself some new fiscal targets. And the one that he highlighted in the speech yesterday was that the cyclical deficit in the financial year 2020-21 should be below 2% of GDP. So that's government borrowing adjusted for ups and downs in the economic cycle. So let's see how he's doing with regard to that target. So the figures here are equivalent to the figures I showed you for the deficit before, but are now presented as a share of GDP, and they're now adjusted for what's believed to be temporary ups and downs in the economic cycle. So you can see the structural deficit falling as a share of GDP from 1920 onwards. And you can see that it's some way below that 2% of national income ceiling that Mr. Hammond chose to set himself in 2020-21. There's nothing magic about 2%. You could have chosen a different number. That's the one he chose to set. And relative to that ceiling, he's clearly got some wiggle room. As he highlighted in his speech yesterday, £26.6 billion of wiggle room in 2020-21. Now, I wouldn't describe that as a real kind of Brexit dividend. He could have chosen 1.5% of GDP or 3% of GDP, and that would have affected how much room to manoeuvre he had relative to that target. One thing that's worth noting is that coming this summer, there's going to be a revision to how we account for loans that are made in the public finances, and in particular, loans that the government makes to students for their tuition fees that it doesn't expect to get back. And at the moment, they're accounted for in a very odd way in the public finances, and the ONS's change is very welcome because it means the public finances are going to better reflect the true position. So nothing in this accounting change will affect the underlying health of the public finances, but it will affect the headline measure of the deficit that we see. And these lighter green bars show you the increase in the deficit that the OBR thinks the ONS is going to reveal in summer. We don't know exactly what the figures are going to be. This is the OBR's guess. And it adds significantly to the headline measure of the deficit, essentially because we're loaning lots of money out to students that we never expect to get back. And these light green bars try to account for the fact that some of that money really feels more like a grant than a loan. Now, because the underlying health of the public finances isn't changed by this, the Chancellor could respond by saying, well, it's a different measure of the deficit, I'm going to apply a different target. That would be a completely coherent argument. He could say, well, if 2% of GDP was right for a measure of the deficit, which didn't really account for these loans, I should have a bigger ceiling for a measure that doesn't. But maybe he's not going to do that. Maybe he's going to keep to a 2% of national income ceiling, even though the deficit will be pushed up by this accounting change. If he does that, his room to manoeuvre will be much reduced, but it will still be quite significant. It'll be about £15 billion. So he'd still be on course to have a deficit cyclically adjusted below 2% of GDP in each financial year and below 2% in that critical year of 2020-21. Now, there's no guarantee that means the deficit will come in below 2% of GDP in that year. It could come in greater if, for example, tax receipts diminish or if spending grows. It doesn't matter if those changes were if those changes were due to some temporary, some cyclical change in the economy. Of course, it wouldn't matter. This is the structural deficit. It would need to be some permanent change in tax revenues or spending, perhaps caused by some permanent change in the strength of the economy. So to give you a rough scale, we reckon that you'd have to lose about 1.5% of productive capacity in order to push the deficit up by about £15 billion, to lose all of your wiggle room. So if some shock came along in the next 12 months or so, which wiped out 1.5% of our productive capacity, that would be enough to put the Chancellor on course to break his target. I don't know if anyone can think of what kind of shock might come along and cause some damage to our economy. Chancellor has a couple of other fiscal targets. I'm not going to dwell on those. I think the key thing to note is that he's on course to meet all three. And it's also worth noting that in 2 years' time, none of these targets will be able to be breached within the current Parliament. Now, the Chancellor does have, or is supposed to have, an overarching fiscal objective. This is in the 2017 Conservative Party manifesto, to deliver a balanced budget by the middle of the next decade. And he's not currently on course to deliver this. We're still running deficits right the way through to 2023. And as Paul will set out in a moment, there's some challenges in getting the deficit down beyond that period. And I think it's far from clear, looking at the Chancellor's behaviour over the last couple of years, that he's setting policy with eliminating the deficit as the key thing he's trying to achieve. So it's not clear that this target is an anchor on policy decisions at the moment. So maybe that suggests it's time for a new set of fiscal targets. Maybe the Chancellor should be consulting on what an improved set of targets would be. Or perhaps not. To borrow a phrase and adapt a phrase from his next door neighbour, maybe no target would be better than a bad target. But actually, maybe the Chancellor already has a target in mind. In his speech yesterday, he stressed that he wanted to make sure he was always continuing to keep our debt falling. So maybe his focus is much more about debt to GDP and ensuring that that falls every year. And if we look at his forecasts, you can see that at the end of the forecast horizon, it is the case that debt to GDP is falling. It's falling by about 1% of GDP a year. Now, actually, given the low level of deficit, or low level of headline deficit he has, that's actually quite a small decline in the debt to GDP ratio. And that's due to a combination of low growth in the economy. So low growth in the denominator means that ratio doesn't fall very fast. And it's also because we're doing a lot of loans that are not scored in the deficit. So actually the debt stock is rising faster than the headline deficit would suggest. But it is falling, and it's falling by about 1% of GDP. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Chancellor had about £15 billion of headroom against his 2% of GDP ceiling on the deficit, if he's prepared to accommodate the extra borrowing that the ONS is going to put in once they've accounted for the student loan change. So let's suppose he decided to borrow an extra £15 billion a year and just meet that rule exactly. Would the debt to GDP ratio still be falling? Well, the answer is yes, it would be. At the end of the forecast horizon, he'd still be on course to have a falling debt ratio, but it would halve that reduction. It'd be falling by just 0.5% of GDP a year. So I guess what I'm trying to stress here is that the Chancellor has wiggle room against his fiscal mandate, his target for the deficit in 2021. If he uses that all up, he would still be able to claim that debt to GDP was falling, and that's something he stressed in his speech yesterday. So what about the measures that he announced in yesterday's statement? They were really on the spending side, and they were about topping up the spending plans. In particular, he announced some additional spending on public services, at least in his provisional totals, in order to respond to higher than expected inflation. So he allocated an extra £1.7 billion in the last year of his forecast horizon relative to the plans he set out in October. About half of that is going to the NHS. That's enough to maintain the Prime Minister's commitment made last summer to deliver the NHS a £20.5 billion real increase in spending. So higher inflation since last summer has meant that you've actually got to spend more in nominal terms to deliver that increase, and the Treasury is now doing that. The rest was just an allocation to departmental spending, some of which will be allocated in this year's spending review. A couple of other things worth noting. The Department for Health and Social Care shifted some of its money from its capital budget to its current budget. The Treasury allowed it to do that. I think that's notable because that's the third year in a row it's done it. So for 3 years in a row, it's had money left over in its capital budget, and it's been decided it wanted to, and it's been allowed to use some of that to pay for day-to-day spending pressures. And the Stronger Towns Fund, which some dubbed the Brexit bribe that was announced a couple of weeks ago, that £1.6 billion worth of spending, well, the Treasury hasn't decided to cut any other budgets to pay for that. What they've done is essentially said it will be found from existing spending totals, but not told us which ones. So there's extra money to be spent, and we don't know where that money's coming from in 1920 and 2020-21. So where does this leave us with the spending review and the outlook for public service spending? So I'm going to focus now on what central government spends on the delivery and administration of public services. So I'm going to ignore investment spending, I'm going to ignore welfare spending, just talk about day-to-day spending on public services. So the path here shows you the totals since 2010. You can see we've delivered pretty substantial cuts on average of about 10%. And you can see going forwards, day-to-day spending on public services is going to rise. But it's still the case that in 2023-24, we'll be spending less in real terms than we were in 2010. So that's a remarkable period for our public services. The population's growing, so you might prefer to look at day-to-day spending per head. That's also going to grow going forwards. You might prefer to look at spending as a share of national income. That's not going to grow going forwards, but it's not going to continue declining either. It's basically flat over the next 5 years. So if your definition of austerity for public services is one of these three definitions, I think you could say that austerity is now at an end. We're not going to reverse the austerity we've already done, but there's not further austerity to come. For the spending review, the announcement yesterday was that it's going to cover 3 years, 2020-21, 21-22, and 22-23. The spending review is going to be launched before the summer recess. Presumably that's the moment where the Chancellor is going to tell us exactly how much money will be available for that spending review. And it will conclude alongside the autumn budget. But it's worth noting we already know quite a lot about spending commitments over that period. So, as I've already mentioned, the Prime Minister's committed to a £20.5 billion increase in the day-to-day budget of NHS England over the next 5 years. That implies some additional money for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland through the Barnett formula. We have an international commitment to spend at least 2% of GDP on defence, and we have a commitment to spend at least 0.7% of aid, 0.7% of GDP on aid, and in practice that means a commitment to spend exactly 0.7% of GDP on aid. So presuming we keep to all these commitments, actually that comprises over half of departmental spending. So the spending review isn't going to be about setting all of departmental spending. It looks like it's really about potentially less than half of spending, given these commitments, which seem very likely to be met and continue to be met. So what does that mean for unprotected departments? Well, actually the increases in spending that I just presented to you on the previous slide aren't enough to pay for all of the commitments the government has. So it means that on the provisional numbers the Chancellor set out yesterday, there would still be some cuts to areas of spending outside of defence, aid and the NHS. So if you wanted to stop that from happening, the Chancellor in real terms would need to find another £2.5 billion by 22-23. If you wanted to prevent the budgets of those unprotected departments falling in per capita terms, he'd need to find nearly £5 billion by 22-23. And if he wanted to prevent them falling as a share of GDP, he'd need to find just over £9 billion extra by 22-23. So on the provisional total set out yesterday, overall spending on departmental budgets is growing, but not by enough to pay for the commitments the government has, which means if you want to keep to those commitments and keep to those provisional plans, you would need to have cuts elsewhere, and austerity would continue at least beyond 2020 for many unprotected services. It's worth stressing that those cuts to unprotected services under those provisional plans, while it would be a continuation of austerity, it would be a much, much slower pace of austerity than what those departments have been used to over the period since 2010. But because it would be cuts coming on top of previous cuts, it would clearly still be challenging to deliver. And there's clearly lots of pressure to increase spending on many of the unprotected areas. So to give you one example, if you decided you wanted to maintain per pupil spending in schools in real terms, you'd need to find another £1 billion extra over that review period. And there's many, many other spending pressures, some of which Paul is going to touch on. And of course, the Chancellor did indicate that he may well be prepared to spend more. He said that if he gets the smooth Brexit that he's hoping for, he may well be prepared to use up some of that wiggle room relative to his fiscal targets. He called that a deal dividend. So he may be prepared to top up those spending plans, borrow a bit more, and that would make the spending review process much easier, and clearly much easier for those unprotected departments. So I'm going to set out an alternative illustrative scenario. I'm going to say what happens if the Chancellor found another £15 billion for public services. So I'm talking about £5 billion for year 1 of the spending review, £10 billion for year 2, and 15 for year 3. That is not a recommendation, it's just an illustration of what kind of a difference that sort of sum of money have, and it's exactly the sum, exactly the wiggle room he has against that 2% of GDP target, ceiling on the deficit in 2020. So it's not just a number picked out of the air. If we did that, overall day-to-day spending by government departments would grow by 2.8% a year over the spending review period instead of 1.2% a year, so much faster growth in spending overall. Of course, the government could still meet its NHS and aid commitments, and if it wanted to, it would be then able to increase the budgets of defence and other unprotected departments by 2.7% a year over that spending review period. They would grow they would also be growing in per capita terms, and they would be rising as share of national income, and I think that would be, for public services at least, an end to austerity under any reasonable definition. So what would that mean for the deficit? Well, this is the forecast for the deficit presented yesterday in the spring statement, and this is what the deficit would look like under that illustrative scenario. So the deficit would remain at around the £30 billion mark that's being projected for 2019-20, comfortably below that 2% of GDP ceiling, but clearly a scenario where the Chancellor isn't trying to get that deficit down to zero by the mid-2020s. So if the Chancellor went for such a scenario, he could correctly claim he was keeping the deficit below 2% of GDP each year. He could also point to the fact that the debt to GDP ratio would be falling, although as I told you earlier on in the talk, if you borrow an extra $15 billion a year, the falls in the debt ratio would be half what they would be under the current forecast. It would be falling by just 0.5% of GDP a year towards the end of the forecast horizon. Another reason why perhaps the £15 billion number is interesting is that back in November 2016, the OBR revised down its receipts forecast by £15 billion as a direct result of the referendum result. So in some alternative world where the vote had gone the other way, we could have been talking about having that £15 billion of extra spending without having to increase the deficit because it would have flowed from higher tax receipts. And actually, if anything, that £15 billion downgrade in receipts looks a bit low. There's a general consensus that the size of the economy now is about 2% smaller than what it would have been had the vote gone the other way. So, for example, the Bank of England has said very clearly that's what they think is the case. And 2% off GDP would be likely to have more than a £15 billion impact on government receipts. So to conclude, in yesterday's statement, we saw a modest increase in the forecast for receipts. That was on top of a larger increase that we saw last autumn. For now, at least, the Chancellor has largely banked rather than spent the additional receipts. But under the provisional spending plans in the OBR's document, it looks like they imply continued austerity for unprotected departments. The Chancellor has headroom against his fiscal targets over this Parliament, even after the student loan accounting change that's coming this summer. So he could, if he wanted, choose to top up his spending plans, end austerity for public services from March 2020, and still meet his fiscal targets. But I think that really would raise the question about what about the supposed ambition to eliminate the deficit by the mid-2020s.